Vexler stood in the observation deck of the Harmonious. Donnan watched the new arrivals with barely concealed skepticism. The humans had arrived 3 weeks ago, and they were nothing like he expected. They were small compared to most Concordat species. Standing barely 2 meters tall with soft pink or brown skin that looked like it would tear at the slightest touch. It had only 2 arms, which seemed inefficient, and their bodies lacked any natural armor or weapons. What bothered Vexler most was their constant noise. They laughed at everything and made jokes that nobody else understood, and they seemed completely unconcerned about the dangers of deep space combat. Vexler had served in the Concordat military for 112 years. He had seen 47 conflicts across 12 systems and fought against pirates, rebels, and even the terrifying Devourers on 2 occasions. His chitinous exoskeleton bore the scars of a century of warfare in his forearms. Could wield weapons with deadly precision. He considered himself unshakable and professional. The humans seemed like children playing at war. They will learn, his second officer Kresh had said the day before, or they will die. Vexler had replied. Now he watched as a group of human soldiers gathered in the wreck area below. Were throwing a small ball back and forth and shouting encouragement at each other. One of them missed the catch, and the ball bounced off his head instead. Of being embarrassed, the human laughed louder than anyone else. This is what Earth sends us, Vexler muttered to himself. Clowns and jesters. The ship's alert system interrupted his thoughts. Red lights flashed across every panel, and the battle klaxon began its harsh, wailing. Vexler's 4 hands moved instantly to his equipment harness. As he rushed toward the bridge, the other officers were already assembling when he arrived. Captain Thelanax was studying a holographic display with her 3 eyes narrowed in concentration. We have received a distress call from Epsilon Tertius, she said without looking up. A mining colony with approximately 40,000 civilians. Vexler felt his internal organs tighten. He knew what was coming before she said it. The Devourers have appeared. Thelanax continued. Initial scans show swarm formation approaching from the eastern continent. Estimated time until the colony is overrun is 6 hours. The bridge fell silent. Everyone knew what the Devourers were. They were the nightmare that every species in the Concordat feared. A hive mind of billions of insect-like organisms that consumed all biological matter in their path. They couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with. They simply devoured. We are the closest ship. Thelanax said, prepare for immediate deployment. All combat personnel to the armory. Vexler moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency. His mind was already working through the tactical challenges. Fighting Devourers required strict discipline and careful defensive protocols. You established strong perimeters and evacuated civilians in organized groups and fell back to defensible positions when necessary, though. Key was never letting them surround you and never sacrificing soldiers unnecessarily, though. Armory was chaos. Soldiers from a dozen different species were checking weapons and loading ammunition and securing armor. The humans were there too, and Vexler noticed something strange. They weren't laughing anymore. Sergeant Maria Chen was the human squad leader. She was a compact woman with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed older than her face. She approached Vexler with a datapad. Sir, requesting tactical brief on Devourer combat protocols. She said. Her voice was crisp and professional. Brought up the standard briefing on his own display. The Devourers attack in waves. He explained. They will probe our defenses. Looking for weak points. Standard response is controlled retreat while maintaining fire superiority. We evacuate civilians in priority groups and fall back to secondary positions as needed. The goal is to preserve our forces while buying time for evacuation. Ship's Chen listened carefully and then asked a single question. How many civilians are we evacuating? 40,000. Vexler replied. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Then we hold until they're all out, she said simply. Vexler felt his mandibles click in confusion. You misunderstand the protocol, he said. We cannot hold indefinitely. Against the Devourers, we establish a fighting retreat that maximizes civilian evacuation while minimizing military casualties. Some civilians will inevitably be lost, but we preserve our fighting force for no. Chen interrupted. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the armory noise like a blade. We hold. We don't leave anyone behind. Before Vexler could respond, the boarding call came. They Moved to the dropships in organized groups, Vexler found himself in the same transport as the human squad. As the ship descended through Epsilon Tertius's atmosphere, he watched the humans carefully. They had transformed the joking and laughing creatures from the rec room. What remained was something else. Entirely, they sat in complete silence, checking their weapons with mechanical precision. Their faces were blank, and their eyes were distant. One human, a young man with red hair, was whispering something under his breath. Vexler's translator picked up the words, "just like Kandahar." The human whispered. Another human, a woman with scars on her dark arms, responded equally quietly. "Just like Stalingrad." Vexler didn't know these words. His translator database had no reference for them, but something in the tone made the scales along. His spine prickle with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. In certainty, through the viewport he could see the mining colony below. Smoke was already rising from the eastern districts. The Devourers had begun their assault. The dropship shook as it entered. Combat descent weapons fire lit up the sky around them. Vexler had done this hundreds of times, but suddenly it felt different. He glanced at Sergeant Chunchi, was staring at nothing, with her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscles jumping in her cheek. Her hands were perfectly steady on her rifle, but Vexler's enhanced senses detected something else. Her heartbeat was racing, and her skin was releasing stress chemicals that his antennae could detect. She was afraid they were all afraid. Not one of them was showing it. The dropship hit the landing zone hard, and the doors blew open. The sound that greeted them was like nothing Vexler had ever heard, a chittering, screaming, howling noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sky to the east was dark, not with clouds, but with billions of flying devourer organisms. The ground was moving like a living carpet. "Form up." Chen shouted. "Standard defensive positions. Remember your training." The humans moved like they had done this 1,000 times. Vexler suddenly realized that maybe they had, as they took their positions in the ruins of the colony plaza. Vexler heard one of the humans laugh. It was a harsh sound without humor. "Here we go again." The human said, "Humanity's favorite game, Last Stand, at the end of the world." Vexler wanted to ask what that meant, but the first wave of devourers was already coming, and there was no more time for questions. The plaza had once been the central hub of the mining colony. Now it was a killing ground. Vexler positioned his squad along the northern corridor while other Concordat forces spread out to cover the remaining approaches. The evacuation ships were landing 2 kilometers behind them in the only clear zone large enough for the massive transports. Civilians were streaming toward salvation in organized columns. They needed time. The question was how much time they could buy. Estimate 2 hours minimum for full evacuation. Captain Thelenax's voice crackled through Vexler's comm unit. "Possibly 3 if we encounter complications." Vexler studied the tactical display there. Devourers were approaching from multiple vectors, and their numbers were staggering. He had fought them before and survived by following doctrine: never commit to a static defense, and always maintain escape routes and preserve your forces above all else. Sergeant Chen appeared at his side. Her squad had taken positions along the eastern face of the plaza where the first assault would hit. "We've set up overlapping fields of fire." She reported. Ammunition reserves positioned at 30-meter intervals. Medical station established in the reinforced basement of structure. For Vexler pulled up the defensive map and studied her positions. "This is too aggressive," he said. "You're too far forward. When the Devourers hit in force, you'll need to fall back to secondary positions. I recommend pulling back now too. With respect, sir, we're not retreating." Chen interrupted. Her dark eyes met his compound gaze without flinching. "Those evacuation ships need 2 hours minimum. We give them 2 hours minimum. You misunderstand combat doctrine against the Devourers." Vexler said. He tried to keep his voice patient. "We cannot hold a static position against unlimited numbers. The proper tactic is a fighting retreat that buys time while preserving our ability to." "I understand the doctrine, sir." Chen said. "We're not following it. We hold this line until every civilian is evacuated. No retreat, no exceptions." Before Vexler could argue, the eastern horizon turned black. Devourers had arrived. They came in a living wave that defied comprehension. Sky filled with billions of flying organisms, each the size of a human fist and covered in razor-sharp appendages. Ground disappeared beneath a carpet of crawling, scuttling things that moved with horrifying coordination. The sound was overwhelming. Chittering screech that seemed to vibrate through Vexler's entire exoskeleton. Here they come. Someone shouted. The universe exploded into violence. Every weapon along the defensive line opened fire. Simultaneous Livlos particle rifle burned. Through the swarm with clinical precision, his century of combat, his consperience guided each shot, and his forearms allowed him to reload and fire without pause. The other Concordat soldiers followed their training. They established killing zones and rotated firing positions and began the planned fighting withdrawal, but the humans didn't move. Vexler watched in disbelief as the human positions became islands in a sea of deathchins. Squad fired with mechanical precision and their weapons barely pausing. As they ejected spent magazines and loaded fresh ones, they called out coordinates and target priorities in clipped voices that showed no emotion. Sector 3 heavy concentration. Covering fire northwest corner. Reloading on my Mark III-2. 1 mark. A massive cluster of flying devourers descended on the eastern position. Any sane soldier would have retreated. The humans opened fire with everything they had. Vexler saw Corporal Jackson, a massive human with dark skin and arms like tree trunks, stand fully exposed and fire a heavy machine gun from the hip. The weapon's recoil would have knocked most species backward. Jackson leaned into it and walked forward, still firing. Devourers in front of him simply ceased to exist. Fall back. 2 secondary positions, as Vexler shouted into the maintain firing retreat. Most of his Concordat soldiers obeyed. The humans ignored him completely. 20 minutes into the battle, Vexler's worst fear materialized. A section of the northern corridor collapsed under the Devourer assault. 3 Concordat soldiers were cut off and surrounded by the swarm. Standard protocol was clear. They were lost. That corridor and maintain the primary defensive line. Casualties were unfortunate but acceptable if they preserved the larger force breach. Northern corridor. Tun's voice cut through the chaos. Rescue team, go, go, go. 4 humans broke from their positions and sprinted directly into the swarm. Vexler thought he was watching a suicide. The humans moved like they had rehearsed this 1,000 times. They formed a wedge with Jackson at the point and cut through the Devourers with sustained fire. They reached the trapped soldiers and grabbed them and started pulling them back. Vexler saw a human woman use her own body as a shield. When one of the rescued soldiers stumbled, Devourers swarmed over her back, and she screamed but didn't let go. The other humans killed the organisms on her and dragged everyone toward safety. They emerged from the corridor carrying the wounded. One human didn't make it out. His body was still in the corridor being consumed. The other 3 humans went back for him. They recovered his body under withering fire. Why? Vexler heard himself ask, why would you risk 4 lives for 3? Why retrieve a corpse? Chen was nearby, reloading her weapon. She glanced at him with an expression he couldn't read. Because we don't leave people behind. She said, living or dead, that's our rule. Vexler felt something shift in his understanding. These humans were terrified. He could smell the fear chemicals pouring off them and see the tremors in their hands when they thought no one was looking. But they weren't running. They were more afraid of abandoning their comrades than they were of Diane. Hour into the battle, the situation deteriorated. Devourers had adapted and found weak points in the defensive perimeter. Several positions had fallen. Despite fierce resistance, the ammunition was running critically low. Evacuation was only 60% complete. Vexler checked his tactical display and made the calculation that every military officer dreads if they didn't retreat immediately. They would all die. All forces prepare for full withdrawal. He transmitted fall back to evacuation zone on my mark. The Concordat soldiers acknowledged and began preparing to move. The humans didn't respond. Sergeant Chen, did you receive the withdrawal order? Vexler demanded. Chen's voice came back steady. Despite the chaos around her, received and declined, sir. Evacuation still needs 45 minutes. We hold? That's a death sentence. Vexler shouted. We cannot hold for 45 more minutes. The mathematics are impossible. Then we change the math. Chen replied, something in her voice made Vexler stop. It wasn't bravado or foolishness. It was simple, absolute certainty. These humans had decided they would hold on. They would hold until they succeeded or until they were all dead. There was no third option in their minds. Vexler looked at his own soldiers. They were professionals, and they had followed his orders. They were ready to retreat then. He looked at the humans. They were preparing for another assault, wave-reloading weapons and redistributing ammunition and helping each other with injuries. One human was quietly crying while she loaded magazines. Another was whispering what sounded like a prayer, but none of them were leaving their positions for the first time in 112 years of military service. Vexler made a decision based not on protocol or doctrine or tactical calculation. Made it based on something he couldn't name. All Cathari forces hold positions. He transmitted to his own species, "We stand with the humans." Kresh's second officer responded with shock in his voice. "Sir, that contradicts all tactical." "I know what it contradicts," Vexler interrupted. "We hold." Chen glanced at him across the plaza. She didn't smile or nod or show any emotion, but something passed between them, an understanding. The next wave hit like a hammer, and Vexler discovered what it meant to truly hold the line. 90 minutes into the defense, and Vexler had stopped counting the dead. The plaza that had been their fortress was now a nightmare landscape. Bodies of devourers were piled so high in some areas that they formed walls. The defensive positions were crumbling. Ammunition counters showed red across every display. Wounded were being treated in the basement of Structure 4, but the medics were running out of supplies. Vexler's forearms moved on pure muscle memory. Load, aim, fire, reload his particle. The rifle was so hot it burned even through his armored gloves next to him. Kresh was firing with 3 of his arms while using the 4th to hold pressure on a wound in his thorax. They were dying. They were all dying. The only question was whether they would die before the evacuation completed. Evacuation status? Vexler rasped into his cum. His voice was hoarse from shouting commands and breathing smoke. 65% complete. Captain Thelenax responded, "Estimate 45 minutes to full evacuation." 45 minutes might as well have been forever. Vexler checked his ammunition counter. 17% remaining. He looked around at the defensive line. Half the positions were silent, either destroyed or abandoned, or simply out of soldiers to man them. The Devourers were learning. They had stopped the mindless frontal assaults and were now probing for weaknesses. They flowed like water around the strong points and exploited every gap. Northern position is falling, Kresh shouted. "We need reinforcements now." There were no reinforcements. Vel made the calculation again. They needed to retreat. There was no other option. The mathematics of survival were absolute. All forces prepare for emergency withdrawal. He began. Then he saw the humans. Corporal Jackson was holding an entire doorway alone. His heavy weapon had run dry, and he was using his rifle. When that ran dry, he pulled out a pistol. When the pistol ran out, he drew a knife. Vexler watched in horror and awe as this human held a choke point through pure determination. Jackson was wounded. Blood ran down his face from a scalp laceration, and his left arm hung at an odd angle, but he was laughing, actually laughing, as he fought. "Is that all you got?" Jackson roared at the Devourers. "My grandmother hits harder." 2 other humans ran to support him. They didn't ask for orders. They just saw a comrade in danger, and moved. Vexler felt something break inside him. His courage, something else, his certainty, his professional detachment, his carefully maintained emotional distance from warfare. These humans were going to die. They knew they were going to die, and they were doing it anyway, because 40,000 civilians needed 45 more minutes. Belay that. Withdrawal order. Vexler transmitted. His voice was steady. "We hold." Kresh turned to stare at him with all 3 eyes. "Sir, that's madness, I know." Vexler interrupted. "Hold the line." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Vexler's life. The Devourers seemed endless. For every 1,000 they killed, 10,000 more appeared. The defensive perimeter shrank, meter by meter. Vexler found himself fighting alongside a human lieutenant named Marcus. Webb looked impossibly young, with smooth skin and bright blue eyes that seemed too innocent for this carnage, but he fought with the controlled fury of someone much older. "How old are you?" Vexler asked during a brief lull, while they reloaded 23 standard years. Webb replied. He didn't look up from his weapon. "You've done this before?" Vexler said. It wasn't a question. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Mars Rebellion, Titan Uprising. Webb recited. "Been in the service since I was 18. 5 years of this why? Vexler asked, "Why do you keep fighting?" Webb finally looked at him, because somebody has to. He said, "Simply because those people behind us are counting on us to hold this line, and because my grandfather held Baystone with less. If he could do it, so can I." Vexler's translator still didn't recognize that word Baystone, but he understood. The meaning behind it, the weight of history, the burden of being worthy of those who came before. What if we can't hold? Vexler asked the question he had never asked in his entire military career. What if it's impossible? Webb checked his ammunition and gave a slight smile. Then we make it possible. He said that's what humans do. We look at impossible situations and we hold anyway. Because the alternative is unacceptable. The Devourers' hit against this wave was different. They concentrated their forces on the eastern approach where the defenses were weakest. The position began to collapse. Vexler saw it happening in slow motion. 3 human soldiers were overwhelmed. They disappeared beneath a living carpet of Devourers. He expected the line to break completely. Instead, the humans counterattacked. Led a squad directly into the swarm, firing on full automatic. They carved through the Devourers with sustained fire and reached the overwhelmed position. When they emerged, they were carrying the wounded. One of the rescued humans was unconscious. Another was missing an arm. The third was a young private named Martinez, who was screaming in terror. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he was completely unresponsive to commands. He had broken psychologically, shattered by the Horichin, and the others didn't judge him or abandon him. They pulled him back to the medical station with the same care they showed the physically wounded. "He'll come back when he can," Webb said. When Vexler asked about it, "They always do. And if they don't, we take care of them anyway. That's the deal." Vexler had never seen anything like it in Concordat. For 6 soldiers who broke mentally, were medically discharged and sent home. Humans treated it like any other wound, something that needed care and time and understanding. The evacuation counter ticked down. 80% complete. 90% the defensive line was barely holding. They had run out of ammunition for the heavy weapons. The particle rifles were failing from overheating. Soldiers were fighting with pistols and knives, and in some cases, just their hands. Vexler's own ammunition counter, read 0, he had switched to using debris as thrown weapons. His forearms gave him strength and accuracy. He had killed hundreds of Devourers. This wet felt primitive and desperate, but it was all they had left. Final evacuation ship is loading. Captain Thelenax transmitted. Her voice was tight with stress. All remaining civilians are aboard. A ragged cheer went up from the defenders. They had done it. 40,000 civilians were safe now. They just had to survive, prepare for combat extraction. Thelenax continued. Transport ships are inbound to your position. Vexler felt hope for the first time in hours. Then Thelenax delivered. The rest unable to land in the combat zone due to Devourer air superiority. Nearest safe landing zone is 4 kilometers northwest. You have 20 minutes to reach extraction point before we initiate orbital bombardment for kilometers through Devourer-controlled territory with no ammunition. In 20 minutes, Vexler looked at the tactical display route to the extraction point, cut through the heaviest Devourer concentrations. It was impossible. They would never make ETH. Opened his mouth to protest when Webb cut him off. Understood command. The lieutenant said calmly, "All forces prepare to move out. Standard leapfrog formation. We're going home, people." The humans began checking their remaining ammunition and preparing for movement. They weren't celebrating, they weren't despairing, they were just getting ready for the next impossible thing. Vexler felt something inside him that he couldn't name. These humans had taught him what courage really was. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was looking at fear and impossibility and death and deciding to take one more step anyway. "Let's go." Chen said she had blood on her face and her armor was cracked, and she looked like she had aged a decade, but her voice was steady for kilometers. "We've run farther in boot camp." Vexler activated his come to his. "Cathari forces, you've all fought with honor today." He said, "The humans have shown us something important about what it means to be a warrior. Now let's show them what Cathari are made of. We run together, we fight together, we survive together." They moved out into the ruins behind them. The Devourer swarm sensed their movement and surged forward. Ahead of them lay 4 kilometers of hell. Vexler had never been more terrified in his life. He had also never been more certain that he was exactly where he needed to be, running beside humans toward an impossible extraction with death on their heels and hope somewhere ahead if they could just keep moving. The first kilometer was a running gunfight through Hell 17. Soldiers remained 8 humans and 9 Concordat allies, including Vexler and Kreshthi, moved in a leapfrog pattern with one group providing covering fire while the other advanced. Then they switched over, and over the Devourers were everywhere. They poured from ruined buildings and swarmed down from shattered towers and erupted from underground tunnels. The sky was black with flying organisms. The ground writhed with crawlers. Vexler fired his last pistol magazine and threw the weapon away. He picked up a length of rebar from the rubble and used it as a spear. His 4 arms gave him reach and power. He stabbed and swung and killed, but the Devourers just kept coming beside him. Human named Rodriguez was treating a wounded Cathari soldier while simultaneously firing her rifle one-handed. Keep moving, she shouted. Don't stop, don't think, just move. The wounded Cathari was named Silvex, had taken a hit to one of her primary legs and couldn't run. Jackson simply picked her up and carried her. The massive human ran with a full-grown Cathari in his arms while firing his rifle from the hip. He didn't complain. He didn't slow down. He just ran 2 clicks down. Webb shouted to go. Stay tight. They rounded a corner and ran straight into a Devourer. Concentration point. Thousands of the organisms were clustered in what had been a transit station. The only way forward was through them grenades. Chen screamed. The humans threw their last explosive devices. The detonations cleared a temporary path through the swarm. They charged through the gap, firing everything they had. Vexler felt Devourers land on his carapace there. Cutting appendages scored his armor, but couldn't penetrate. He crushed them against walls and scraped them off with debris. Human private named Patel was beside him. Young man was bleeding from multiple wounds, and his face was gray with shock. They were passing through a narrow corridor when a massive Devourers dropped from above. Vexler saw it coming. He started to dodge. Then he saw the trajectory. They would miss him, but they would hit. Kresh, who was right behind him, Pottle took the human. Didn't hesitate. He threw himself backward and crashed into Kresh, knocking the Cathari out of the way. The Devourers hit Patel instead. They swarmed over him in seconds. Jackson turned back and tried to pull Patel free, but it was already too late. The human was gone. They kept moving. There was no time to stop, no time to grieve, just the endless, desperate push forward. Kirsch was making a keening sound of distress. He saved me. The Cathari kept saying, why did he save me? Because that's what we do, Rodriguez answered. She was limping badly, but still moving. We protect each other. No exceptions, 1.5 kilometers. They were in a residential sector, now the buildings here were mostly intact, which provided cover, but it also meant more places for Devourers to ambush from. Every doorway could hide death. Every a window could spawn a swarm web, led from the front, moving with careful precision. He used hand signals to direct the group through the safest routes. Vexler was amazed at the lieutenant's tactical awareness. The young human seemed to have a sixth sense for danger. Left side. Webb shouted. A Devourer cluster erupted from a collapsed apartment. The soldiers pivoted. An engaged Chun killed the first wave with her last magazine. When her rifle clicked empty, she drew a combat knife. Vexler had never seen knife fighting like what Chen demonstrated. She moved like flowing water. Every cut was precise and efficient. No wasted movement, no hesitation. She carved through Devourers with brutal grace. Then her knife broke them. Blade snapped against a Devourer's armored carapace. Chen didn't pause. She hacked up a piece of broken metal and kept fighting. They pushed through the ambush and kept moving. 1 kilometer, remaining 15 minutes. Until orbital bombardment, 13 soldiers left. They had lost 4 more in the residential sector 3. Cathari and 1 human. Every loss was a knife in Vexler's heart's butt. They couldn't stop the moment they stopped moving. They died. I can see the extraction point. Webb transmitted. His voice was hoarse but excited. 800 meters. We're going to make it. Vexler felt something like hope surge through his exhaustion. Then the universe conspired against them. One final Timea Massive devourer concentrator organism rose from the rubble ahead. These were rare command nodes for the swarm. They were the size of a ground transport and covered in sensory organs. The concentrator was surrounded by thousands of guardian organisms. There was no way around it. The street was too narrow, and the buildings too damaged to provide alternate routes. Going through the concentrator meant fighting through an army. Webb stared at the obstacle, and Vexler saw the calculation happen in the human's eyes. The math was simple. They couldn't win this fight, not with 13 exhausted soldiers, not with almost no ammunition, not in the time they had remaining. We can't make it through that. Kresh said quietly. Vexler knew he was right. They were 800 meters from salvation. They might as well have been 800 light years. Then Lieutenant Marcus Webb did something that Vexler would remember for the rest of his long life. Young human stood up, fully exposed, and checked his ammunition. Counter 3% remaining, maybe 20 rounds. Webb looked at his soldiers at Chen and Jackson and Rodriguez and the others, at Vexler and Kresh and Silvex. Get them out, he said to Chun. His voice was calm, almost gentle. That's an order, Sergeant. Chun's eyes went wide. Marcus, no, get them out, Webb roared. Then he turned and walked directly toward the concentrator, firing on full automatic, screaming at the top of his lungs. Every devourer in the area pivoted toward him. The concentrator's guardian organisms surged forward. Webb didn't run high. Walked steadily forward, firing and reloading and firing again, rawing again, drawing the entire swarm to himself, creating a gap. A temporary corridor to the left of the concentrator. Move, Chen screamed. Her voice was breaking. He's giving us a chance. Move now. Vexler couldn't move. He was watching Webb die. The lieutenant was surrounded by thousands of devourers. His weapon clicked empty. He drew his pistol. The pistol ran dry. He drew his knife, still fighting, still screaming, still buying them seconds with his life. No. Jackson said. His voice was quiet, but absolute. Fuck that. The big human turned and started running toward Webb. Not wait, warned Jackson. No. Chen shouted. Jackson ignored her. Vexler heard himself screaming something in his own language. Then he was running. Two toward the swarm, toward certain death, toward Webb. Kresh and Silvex ran with him. So did Chen and Rodriguez and every human still standing. They all turned around and charged back toward Webb. They hit the devourer concentration like a hammer. 13 exhausted soldiers with no ammunition and failing weapons, throwing themselves into impossible odds because one of their own was in danger, and humans didn't leave people behind ever. They carved a corridor through the swarm with knives and improvised weapons and raw determination. Vexel used his forearms to literally tear devourers apart. Jackson was roaring something incomprehensible. Chun was crying and fighting and screaming all at once. They reached Webb. The lieutenant was down, covered in wounds, barely conscious. Jackson picked him up like he was a child. I got you, brother, the big human said. We all got you. Then they turned and ran, all of them carrying Webb, fighting every meter. The extraction point was visible now. The transport ship was landing with its bay doors already open. 200 meters. The devourers were right behind them. 100 meters. Vexler's legs were burning. His arms were numb. He was running on pure will. 50 meters. He could see the transport crew waving them forward. 20 meters. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. Stumbled into the transport bay in a mass of exhausted bodies. The doors slammed shut behind them. Ship lifted off with an acceleration that would have been dangerous under normal circumstances. Through the closing doors, Vexler watched orbital bombardment begin. White-hot plasma rained from the sky. The entire colony turned to molten glass. They had made it out with 40 seconds to spare. Vexler collapsed on the deck. His entire body was shaking. Adrenaline crash was hitting everyone. Webb was being rushed to medical. Rodriguez was treating wounds with shaking hands. Jackson was sitting with his head in his hands, making a sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. Sat down next to Vexla. Her face was streaked with tears and blood. We made it, she said. Her voice was wondering, like she couldn't quite believe it. All 17 of us. All made it. Vexler tried to speak, but found he couldn't. Sound was coming from his vocal apparatus, a sound he had never made before in 120 12 years he was weeping, not from pain or fear, from something else. Something he didn't have words for. Jackson reached over and pulled Vexler against his side in what humans called a hug. "I got you, buddy." The human said, his voice was gentle, "We made it. We all made it." And Vexler understood for the first time in his life what it meant to be part of something greater than yourself, too. Be willing to die for others and to have others willing to die for. Youth humans had taught him not through words but through actions what it really meant to hold the line. 3 days later, Vexler walked into the medical bay of the Harmonious Dawn. His physical injuries were minor: cracked carapace in 2 places and strained muscles in his lower left arm, and some scoring on his exoskeleton that would leave permanent marks. The medical staff had cleared him for duty, but Vexler knew that something inside him had changed. Something couldn't be fixed with regeneration treatments. He found the human ward by following the sound of laughter. It seemed impossible they had survived one of the most brutal combat actions in Concordat history. They had lost comrades, they had faced annihilation, and they were laughing. Vexler stood in the doorway and watched. Corporal Jackson was sitting up in bed with his left arm, and a regeneration sleeve. He was arguing loudly with Rodriguez about something called basketball. Private Chen, the sergeant's younger brother, had a bandaged head and was dealing cards to a mixed group of humans, and Lieutenant Webb was propped up in bed covered in bandages. He looked terrible, but he was smiling, the human who had broken during combat. Private Martinez was sitting with the group, though. Others were including him in their card game like nothing had happened. No shame, no judgment, just acceptance. Vexler, Jackson called out when he noticed him. "Get over here, man. We're playing poker, and I need someone who doesn't know all of Chen's tells." Vexler approached slowly. He still didn't understand how they could be like this. "How are you?" he asked. Seemed inadequate, alive. Jackson replied with a huge grin, "Which is better than the alternative. Doc says I'll be back to full duty in 2 weeks, just in time for the next insane suicide mission." The other humans laughed like this was normal, like they did this all the time. Vexler found Sergeant Chen in the recovery wing. She was supposed to be resting, but was instead reviewing combat reports on a data plotter. Right leg was in a medical brace, and she had a healing cut across her forehead. "Sergeant," Vexler said. Chun looked up and smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. "Vexler," she said, "good to see you on your feet. Pull up a chair." Vexler sat. For a long moment he didn't know what to say. "How can you be like this?" Finally asked. "You should be traumatized, broken. We faced annihilation." Chen set down her data pad. "We are traumatized," she said quietly. "Every single one of us. Martinez isn't the only one who will have nightmares. We'll all carry this." Vexler's antennae twitched in confusion. "But you're laughing and playing games. How?" Chen leaned back and looked at the ceiling. "Can I tell you about Earth?" She asked. "About human history?" Vexler nodded. "Humans evolved as prey." Chen began. "We weren't the biggest or strongest or fastest. We didn't have claws or armor or venom. Everything on our planet wanted to eat us. So we learned something." She looked at Vexler. "We learned that fear is just information. It tells you you're in danger. What you do with that information is what matters. Our ancestors could have hidden in caves forever, but they didn't. They took their fear and used it. They made it a weapon. They got scared, and then they acted anyway." Vexler thought about what he had seen on Epsilon Tertius. The humans shaking with terror but holding the line. "You were all afraid?" He said. "I could smell it." Chen smiled, terrified. She confirmed. "Every second, but we've learned something over millions of years of evolution. Fears just love wearing armor." Vexler tilted his head. "I don't understand fear for our comrades." Chen explained. "Fear of failing the people depending on us. Fear of being unworthy of the sacrifices others have made. We're not brave because we don't feel fear. We're brave because we feel fear and we act anyway. Because the alternative is abandoning what we love, and that's worse than death." She picked up her datapad again. "We laugh and play games because that's how we process trauma. Stay connected to each other. We remember that we're alive, and we prepare for the next time because there's always a next time." Vexler sat in silence, processing understanding. For 112 years he had thought courage meant the absence of fear. He had been completely wrong. The door opened, and Lieutenant Webb limped in on crutches. He looked surprised to see Vexler. "Sir," he said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting." Chen said. "We were just talking about fear." Webb made his way to a chair and sat heavily. "Fear is important. He said, keeps you sharp. The day you stop being afraid is the day you get sloppy, and sloppy gets people killed, but you went back for me. Vexler said, all of you turned around and charged into certain death. That's not fear, that's the opposite of fear. Jackson had appeared in the doorway. The big human was supposed to be in bed, but apparently couldn't stay away. That was fear. Jackson said, I was scared out of my mind, but I was more scared of losing Webb, more scared of living with myself if I didn't try. So yeah, I turned around because some things are worth being afraid for. Vexler felt his understanding shift. Had thought the humans were fearless. Now he realized they were the most afraid species he had ever met. They just refused to let fear stop them. The Concordat wants to award medals. Vexler said, for the defense of Epsilon Tertius, the humans looked uncomfortable. We don't need medals. Chen said, we just did our job. Your job redefined courage for everyone who witnessed it. Vexler replied. Webb shrugged. We held a line protected. Some civilian standard stuff. You saved 40,000 lives. Vexler said, his voice was sharp. You held against impossible odds. You taught us what it means to truly stand for something. It is not standard, Jackson grinned. Well, when you put it that way, yeah, okay, it was pretty badass. They all laughed even. Vexler found himself making the chittering sound that was Catherine laughter. Later that day, Vexler submitted a formal request. He wanted a permanent transfer to human units by the next morning. 6 other Cathari soldiers had submitted the same request, so had Develanathi and Athrost humans had shown them something. Not that humans were better warriors, though they were terrifying in combat. They had shown that courage wasn't about being unafraid, was about being afraid and acting anyway about. Refusing to abandon what you loved even when fear screamed at you to ruin. A week later, Vexler stood in the hangar by he was part of Sergeant Chun's squad. Neve were preparing for deployment to another contested system. The mission briefing suggested heavy combat, probable casualties. Young human private approached him. Her name was Williams, and this was her first deployment. She looked nervous. Sir, she said quietly, do you ever get scared anymore? Before meeting humans, Vexler would have said no. He would have claimed that experience made you immune to Furno. He knew better every single time. He answered honestly. The fear never goes away. You just learn what to do with it. Williams nodded slowly. What do you do with it? Vexler thought about Epsilon, Tertius about, Webb walking toward, certain death about, Jackson turning around about. Chen holding the line while her heart rate spiked with terror. I remember what I'm fighting for, he said. I remember the people beside me, and I take one more step forward. Even when everything in me wants to run, William smiled. It was a nervous smile, but it held determination. My grandmother always said courage is being scared and doing it anyway. She sounds wise. Vexler replied. The loading ramp opened. It was time to go. Vexler walked up the ramp with his new squad, his family. He was more afraid than he had ever been in his life. He knew that fear would never leave him now, but he also knew something else. Fear wasn't his enemy. Fear was the price of having something worth protecting. Humans had taught him that some things were worth any price. The transport lifted. A Vexler sat between Jackson and Rodriguez across from him. Chen was checking her weapon. Webb was reviewing tactical data. Martinez was quiet, but present. They were all afraid. He could sense it, but not one of them was backing down. You know what I learned? Jackson said. Suddenly he was looking at Vexler. What? Vexler asked. I learned that fear is how you know you're alive. Jackson grinned. And brother, we are very, very alive. The transport accelerated toward the jump point. Another mission, another impossible situation, another chance to stand beside humans and discover what you're capable of. When you refuse to let fear. When Vexler closed his eyes, he was terrified. He was also exactly where he belonged. Welcome to the human race. Chen had said we're terrified all the time. It's how we know we're Ali. Vegasler understood. Now fear wasn't weakness. Fear was the foundation of every brave thing humans had ever done. And now it was his foundation. The transport jumped to hyperspace, and Vexler smiled, because he had finally learned what fear really was. It was the price of love and the beginning of courage, and it was the most human thing he had ever felt.